I'm 63 years old. For years I lived a predictable life, teaching, following rules, and trying to make sense of the world. But life has a way of shaking things up, doesn't it? After I retired, I moved to a small, quiet town, hoping to find peace. I thought I'd spend the rest of my days in solitude, learning to live with the loneliness that came after losing Edgar, my husband. I had said goodbye to the past, or so I thought. But the past has a funny way of showing up at your door when you least expect it, and that's exactly what happened when Carlos came back into my life. Carlos was Edgar's stepson. I hadn't seen him in 3 years. Back then, he was just a reckless, carefree kid. But the man who stood at my doorstep that day was completely different. At 27, life had clearly been hard on him. I could hear it in his voice when he called and asked, "Can I stay with you for a while?" Of course, I said yes. My door was always open to him. But the moment I opened that door and saw him standing there, I realized something. Maybe I was the one who needed help. Carlos had changed. His shoulders were broader, his eyes deeper. That boyish look was gone, replaced by something stronger, more intense. And the way he looked at me, it stirred something inside me that I hadn't felt in years. The real shift happened the next night. It was late, and the air in the house felt heavy, almost electric. I wasn't used to having someone else in my space after years of living alone. Carlos had left early that morning and hadn't returned until close to midnight. When he walked in, he looked exhausted, a little drunk, but not out of control. His eyes carried a weight I couldn't ignore. "You okay?" I asked as I closed the door behind him. He nodded, taking a deep breath. "It's been a long night," he said, his voice low and tired. I felt a wave of tenderness wash over me. This young man was carrying so much on his shoulders. Without thinking, I turned toward the kitchen. "I'll make you some coffee. It might help you sober up a bit." As I stood at the counter, I could feel his eyes on me, even with my back turned. It was a strange feeling, one I hadn't experienced in years. "This place is warmer than I expected," Carlos said suddenly. I glanced at him over my shoulder. "You mean the town?" "Warmer than anywhere I've been," he replied, but his eyes weren't looking at the kitchen. They were looking at me. For a moment, my heart pounded so hard I thought it might leap out of my chest. His gaze was intense, almost overwhelming. It was as if he was seeing me for the first time, really seeing me. The silence in the kitchen was deafening as the coffee brewed. Carlos leaned against the counter, one hand in his pocket, the other running through his hair. He looked tired, maybe even a little broken. "You know," he said after a moment, his voice soft and thoughtful, "sometimes, no matter where you go, you can't escape feeling lonely." I looked into his eyes as I handed him his cup. There was a vulnerability there I hadn't seen in a long time. "Loneliness is a strange thing," I said, my voice carrying a quiet sadness. "Sometimes you get so used to it that even when someone shows up, you don't know how to handle it." Carlos took the cup, bringing it to his lips. "And you?" he asked, taking a sip. "Did you get used to it?" I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of that question settle over me. "I don't know if I'd call it getting used to it," I admitted, "but over time I learned to accept it. Life doesn't go back to what it was, but that doesn't mean you stop thinking about what's missing." Carlos nodded, but he didn't look away. "Sometimes people think they've gotten used to being alone," he said quietly, "but really, they're just trying not to feel anything." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. Maybe he was right. Maybe I hadn't really gotten used to being alone. I had just been avoiding feeling anything at all. That night marked the beginning of something I couldn't ignore. Over the next few weeks, the distance between Carlos and me began to shrink. It wasn't something we talked about, but it became more obvious with each passing day. I started moving more freely around the house. In the mornings, I didn't bother tying my robe as tightly as I used to. I wasn't alone anymore, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel uncomfortable about it. Carlos seemed to notice the change too. He wasn't acting the same way he did when he first arrived. Within a few weeks, he seemed to have moved beyond just getting used to being here. He was acting like he belonged, like he wasn't just staying for a while, but had settled in for good. Most nights, instead of going out, he stayed with me. We'd have dinner together, talk for hours, and somewhere along the way, we started having movie nights. We'd sprawl out on the couch, watching films as time slipped away. Carlos would make comments, laugh out loud, and I'd catch myself watching him instead of the screen. There was a warmth inside me I hadn't felt in years. I never thought I could feel this comfortable around someone again. But that night was different. We were watching a movie, the room dimly lit, the flickering glow of the street lamp outside, casting soft shadows through the half-open curtains. Carlos's hand rested on the couch beside mine, his fingers just barely brushing against mine. As the movie played, I became aware of a slow-building tension between us. The space between our hands was getting smaller and smaller, as if neither of us was consciously making a move, but we were somehow closing the gap anyway. At some point, I felt his gaze shift from the screen to me. Slowly, I turned my head, and our eyes met. This time, there was nothing hesitant about the way he looked at me. His eyes were deep, unreadable, filled with something unspoken. My heart pounded so hard I thought he could hear it, but I didn't look away. It was like every word we could have said had disappeared, leaving only this moment between us. Carlos tilted his head slightly, his lips parting just a little, and in that moment I knew one thing. This was just the beginning, and there was no going back.